Montana Territory, 1872. The winter wind howled across the barren plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another blizzard. William Rutherford stood at the window of his modest cabin, watching as the first snowflakes began their descent from the darkening sky. At 25, he had already spent 3 harsh years carving out his homestead from this unforgiving land, and the isolation had settled into his bones as surely as the cold. A man needs nothing but his own 2 hands and the good sense God gave him, William muttered to himself, repeating the words his father had drilled into him since boyhood. He had built this place alone, had survived alone, and believed with conviction that alone was how a man thrived in the West. Partnerships meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed on the frontier. The cabin was well built but sparse, a testament to necessity rather than comfort. A single bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, though he never understood why he'd made the second, and a stone fireplace that struggled against Montana's bitter chill. The walls were bare save for his father's old rifle and a small mirror that reflected a young man with wheat-colored hair and eyes the shade of prairie grass after rain. Despite his youth, fine lines had already begun to form at the corners of those eyes, marks of squinting against harsh sun and harsher realities. William moved away from the window, stoking the fire as the wind's moans grew louder. The letter that had arrived last week lay unopened on the table, the elegant handwriting taunting him. He'd advertised for a mail-order bride 6 months ago during a moment of weakness, a night when the silence of the prairie had pressed in so heavily he thought he might suffocate beneath it. But that had been a mistake, a foolish surrender to loneliness. He decided to send her away the moment she arrived. Companionship was a luxury the frontier didn't afford. His father had taught him that when his mother died on their journey west. William had been only 10, watching as his father dug the shallow grave with hands bloodied by the shovel's rough handle. "This is what happens when you let yourself need someone," his father had said, not a single tear falling. "The West takes everything you love." A sound outside broke through his memories, the distant rumble of wagon wheels struggling through the gathering snow. William frowned, reaching for his coat. The stage wasn't due for 3 more days. No travelers in their right mind would be out with a storm brewing. Unless. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The bride. His bride. She wasn't supposed to arrive until next week. He'd planned to send word to turn her away before then. Now she was here, with night falling and a blizzard rolling in, leaving him no choice but to offer shelter. "Damn it all," he muttered, grabbing his hat and stepping out into the swirling snow. The wagon came to a stop before his cabin, the driver already looking anxious about the darkening sky. "Got your delivery, Rutherford," the man called out, gesturing to a small figure huddled beneath a woefully inadequate traveling cloak. William watched as she climbed down unassisted, her movements graceful despite obvious exhaustion. When she turned to face him, the breath caught in his throat. She was young, perhaps 20, with hair the color of wheat honey falling in waves beneath her bonnet. Her eyes, even in the dim light, were a startling blue, like summer sky reflected in a clear mountain lake. Her dress, once a fine burgundy traveling outfit, was creased and trail-worn, but she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Mr. Rutherford?" Her voice was steady, though she couldn't hide the chattering of her teeth as the wind cut through her thin cloak. "I am Margaret Allen, your correspondence bride." "You're early," he said flatly, aware of how unwelcoming he sounded but unable to soften his approach. Better she understand now that this had been a mistake. "The stage was ahead of schedule," she replied, chin lifted slightly. "I apologize if this causes any inconvenience." The driver interrupted, already turning his team around. "Got to get back before this weather turns, Miss Allen. Good luck to you." The man gave William a nod that seemed to contain a warning before snapping the reins and disappearing into the swirling snow. William stared at the woman before him. This stranger he had impulsively invited into his life during a moment of weakness, and felt a surge of panic. She represented everything he had taught himself to avoid: responsibility for another's happiness, vulnerability, the terrible risk of loss. "There's a storm coming," he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin. "We should get inside." She followed him silently, her small traveling case clutched in gloved hands. When they entered the cabin, the warmth of the fire seemed to give her new life. She removed her bonnet, revealing more of that honey gold hair, and looked around at what was meant to be her new home. "It's very nice," she said, though her eyes couldn't hide her assessment of the bare walls and minimal furnishings. "It's not finished," William replied defensively. "I've been focusing on the barn and the livestock. Interior comforts come last." Margaret nodded, then squared her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Mr. Rutherford, I sense you may be having second thoughts about our arrangement." Her directness caught him off guard. "Miss Allen, Margaret, please. If we are to be married—" "That's just it," he interrupted, the words tumbling out before he could temper them with kindness. "I made a mistake in advertising for a bride. The frontier is no place for a woman like you. It's harsh and unforgiving. Men who try to build something tender here only end up burying it." To his surprise, she didn't cry or plead. Instead, a flash of something like anger crossed her face. "And what kind of woman do you presume me to be, Mr. Rutherford? One made of porcelain and lace, incapable of enduring hardship?" She moved closer to the fire, removing her gloves to warm her hands. "I left nothing behind in Boston. I came west knowing full well what awaited me. You can't possibly understand. My father was a doctor," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I assisted him during the war. I have seen men torn apart by cannonballs and sutured wounds by lamplight while battles raged. I have watched mothers die in childbirth and children succumb to fevers I was powerless to break. Do not presume to lecture me about hardship, Mr. Rutherford." William fell silent, studying this woman who was nothing like what he had expected. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and their frames, reminding them both of the storm's approach. "You can stay until the weather clears," he said finally. "Then I'll arrange passage back east for you. And if I refuse to go, this isn't up for debate. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. The bed is yours." Before she could argue further, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "There's stew on the stove. Help yourself." Outside, the snow was falling more heavily, the world turning white and strange around him. William trudged toward the barn, his mind in turmoil. Something about Margaret Allen disturbed him deeply, not her boldness or her beauty, though both were considerable. It was the way she had looked at him, as if she could see past his carefully constructed walls to the loneliness he refused to acknowledge. That night, lying on a bed of hay while the storm raged, William tried to convince himself he was doing the right thing in sending her away. But for the first time in years, the silence of his solitary existence seemed less like security and more like a prison of his own making. Morning brought a world transformed by snow, pristine white drifts piled high against the cabin and barn. William emerged to find smoke already rising from the chimney. Inside, Margaret stood at his stove, somehow having coaxed a more appetizing breakfast from his meager supplies than he had managed in months. "Good morning," she said, not looking up from her work. "I hope you don't mind. I found your supplies and thought you might appreciate a hot meal after spending the night in the barn." William hung his coat by the door, eyeing the plate of perfectly cooked eggs and pan bread. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother, before she passed." "Then necessity." She placed the plate on the table. "Please, eat while it's hot." He sat reluctantly, aware of how strange it felt to have another person in this space that had been solely his for so long. The food was better than anything he'd eaten in years. "The storm has buried us in," Margaret observed, glancing out the window. "I suspect we may be confined together for several days." William swallowed a bite of bread. "I'll dig us out. The trading post is only 5 miles. In this?" She raised an eyebrow. "Even I know better than to attempt travel after a Montana blizzard, Mr. Rutherford. The drifts can swallow a horse whole." She was right, though he hated to admit it. They were trapped together, this unwanted bride and the man who no longer wanted her. "Since it appears we will be sharing this cabin for the immediate future," Margaret continued, seating herself across from him, "perhaps we should establish some ground rules." "Ground rules?" "Yes. For instance, I would appreciate if you would sleep in your own bed. The arrangement last night was gallant but impractical. I am perfectly comfortable making a pallet by the fire." William shook his head. "I won't have a woman sleeping on my floor." "Then we shall have to devise another solution, because I won't have a man sacrificing his health in a freezing barn on my account." Her tone brooked no argument. "Furthermore, I propose we divide the household duties equitably. You have your outdoor work, I will manage the interior. I noticed your mending pile is quite substantial." William stared at her, confounded by her practical approach to their situation. He had expected tears, recriminations, or attempts at seduction, not this calm, businesslike attitude. "Miss Allen, Margaret." "Margaret," he conceded, "this arrangement is temporary. As soon as the snow clears." "Yes, you've made your intentions quite clear." She rose and began clearing his empty plate. "But until then, we might as well make the best of our circumstances." The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. William spent his mornings digging paths to the barn and chopping wood, while Margaret transformed his bachelor quarters into something resembling a home. She discovered his mother's old sewing kit and mended his shirts with tiny, precise stitches. She rearranged the sparse furniture to create the illusion of separate spaces. At night, despite his protests, they took turns sleeping in the bed while the other used a pallet by the fire. They spoke little at first, the silence between them charged with unspoken thoughts. William found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The graceful way she moved around the small space, the concentration in her eyes as she worked, the gentle curve of her lips when something amused her. On the fourth morning, as they ate breakfast, Margaret suddenly asked, "Why did you advertise for a bride if you had no intention of marrying?" William set down his coffee cup. "I did have the intention. At the time. What changed?" He looked away, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. "Nothing changed. I simply came to my senses. Most men in the territories are desperate for wives. You seem desperate to avoid having one." She tilted her head, studying him. "What are you afraid of, William?" The use of his given name startled him. "I'm not afraid. I'm practical. The frontier kills the weak and the sentimental. I've seen it happen." "Is that what happened to your family?" Her voice had softened. William stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check the livestock." He spent the morning in the barn, his mind churning with unwelcome memories. His mother's face, pale with fever. His father's hands, once strong, grown gnarled and bitter with grief. The years of watching him retreat into himself until one winter morning, William found him cold in his bed, having simply given up the will to continue. When he finally returned to the cabin, Margaret was standing at the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. She turned as he entered, and he was struck again by her beauty, not the fragile, ornamental beauty he had feared, but something deeper and more resilient. "I apologize," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have pried." William hung up his coat, surprised by her apology. "My mother died on the trail when I was young. Fever. My father never recovered from it, though he lived another 15 years. Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And you decided love was a liability." "Not just love. Connection of any kind." He moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. "The West doesn't forgive weakness. Is that what you think love is? Weakness?" She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent she somehow maintained even in these primitive conditions. What if it's the opposite? What if surviving alone isn't strength, but merely existing? William looked down at her, struck by the earnestness in her expression. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself as much as me." A shadow crossed her face. "Perhaps I am." She turned away, moving back to the window. "I didn't come west solely for marriage, William. I came to escape. In Boston, I was damaged goods." "What do you mean?" She traced a pattern in the condensation on the window glass. "I was engaged once before, to a respected surgeon who worked with my father. Everyone considered it a perfect match." Her voice grew distant. "Until the night he showed me what lay beneath his respectable facade. His appetites were violent." William felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "Did he hurt you?" He tried. "I fought back." A small, grim smile touched her lips. "My father's scalpel was nearby. I only meant to frighten him, but he was drunk and lunged at me. The cut wasn't deep, but it was enough to end the engagement. And my reputation." The revelation hung between them, changing the air in the small cabin. William saw her differently now, not as an unwanted obligation or a threat to his solitude, but as a survivor, like himself. "So you see," Margaret continued, "I understand what it means to protect oneself from pain. But I'm beginning to wonder if in building walls to keep out suffering, we haven't also walled ourselves away from any chance at joy." That night, as snowflakes drifted past the window and the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, They talked as they never had before. Margaret spoke of her childhood in Boston, her work alongside her father, and her dreams of perhaps establishing some kind of medical practice even here on the frontier. William found himself sharing stories of his own. The beauty of Montana in spring, the satisfaction of watching crops grow from the soil he'd tilled with his own hands, even his secret hope of one day breeding horses. When it came time to sleep, neither moved toward the bed or the pallet. They sat before the fire, shoulder to shoulder, until Margaret finally dozed off, her head coming to rest against him. William remained still, listening to her soft breathing, feeling something inside him shift and crumble like spring ice breaking on a frozen river. The next morning brought clear skies and bright sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. It also brought visitors, 3 riders approaching from the direction of the nearest settlement. William spotted them from the barn and hurried back to the cabin. "We have company coming," he told Margaret, who was kneading dough at the table. "Neighbors, I think." She looked up, flour dusting her cheeks. "Should I hide? Would you prefer they not know about me?" Her question caught him off guard. Would he? Just days ago, the answer would have been an immediate yes. Now he found himself hesitating. "No," he said finally. "No need to hide." The riders turned out to be James Holloway, who owned the neighboring ranch, his son, and a man William didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to authority. "Rutherford," Holloway called out as they dismounted. "Thought we'd check if you survived the blizzard. This here's Marshal Dawson from Helena." William shook hands with the men, his gaze lingering on the marshal. "What brings law enforcement out this way?" Dawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for a fugitive. Woman from back east. Stabbed her fiancé, a prominent doctor, then fled west. We have reason to believe she came to Montana territory." William felt his body go rigid. "That's so." Dawson surveyed the homestead. "Nasty business. Doctor nearly died. His family's offering a substantial reward." Before William could respond, the cabin door opened and Margaret emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped short at the sight of the visitors, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly when they landed on the marshal. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady though William could see the tension in her shoulders. "Will you be staying for coffee? I've just put a pot on." Holloway removed his hat. "Ma'am, didn't realize Rutherford here had company." "This is Miss Allen," William said, moving to stand beside her. "My fiancée from Boston. She arrived just before the storm." He felt rather than saw Margaret's surprise at his words, but she recovered quickly, stepping forward with a smile that revealed nothing of her fear. "It's a pleasure to meet neighbors. William has told me so little about the community here." "That's because he barely participates in it," Holloway said with a laugh. "Most unsociable man in the territory. But perhaps that will change now that he has a pretty bride to show off." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Margaret. "Boston, you say? I spent some time there myself." "Which neighborhood?" "Beacon Hill," she replied smoothly. "Though I spent most of my time at Massachusetts General, where my father practiced." "Your father was a doctor?" "Yes. He passed last year." She met the marshal's gaze without flinching. "Please, do come in from the cold." Inside, Margaret served coffee with a steady hand while William watched the marshal, who seemed unable to take his eyes off her. The conversation remained superficial. Talk of weather, cattle prices, spring planting. But underneath ran a current of tension so palpable William could almost taste it. When Holloway mentioned a community gathering plan for the following week, William surprised himself by saying, "We'll be there." "Won't we, dear?" Margaret's eyes met his, understanding passing between them. "Of course. I'm eager to meet everyone." After the visitors departed, William watched through the window as they rode away, the marshal looking back once at the cabin before they disappeared over a rise. "He suspects," Margaret said quietly beside him. "But he doesn't know." William turned to face her. "Why did you lie to me? You said you only threatened your fiancé, not that you stabbed him." Her face paled. "I didn't lie. I said he lunged at me and was cut. I never said how deeply." She moved away from the window, wrapping her arms around herself. "He didn't merely try to hurt me, William. He tried to violate me in ways I cannot speak of. The wound I inflicted was defensive, but his family has wealth and influence. They twisted the truth." William believed her. He had seen the marshal's eyes, cold, assessing, the eyes of a man who followed orders from those with money rather than any true sense of justice. "You call me your fiancé," Margaret said after a moment. "Why?" A single woman traveling alone would raise questions. A fiancé is more respectable. And when the marshal inquires in town and learns you only recently advertised for a mail-order bride, William hadn't thought that far ahead. "We'll be gone by then." "We?" Her eyes widened. "I have a friend in Idaho Territory. We can leave tomorrow, be there within a week." The plan formed as he spoke it, surprising him with how right it felt. "We'll need a story. We met in Boston when I traveled there last year on business. We corresponded, fell in love, and I sent for you." Margaret stared at him. "Why would you do this? Risk everything for someone you were ready to send away just days ago?" William moved toward her, stopping just short of touching her. "Because I was wrong. About you. About everything." That night, they sat at the table planning their departure. What to take, what to leave behind, which route would be safest. William found himself energized rather than fearful, the prospect of leaving his homestead less painful than he would have imagined a week ago. "We could be married," Margaret said suddenly. "For appearance's sake. It would make our story more convincing." William looked up from the map he was studying, caught off guard by her practical tone. "For appearance's sake," he repeated. "Yes." She kept her eyes on the papers before her. A marshal would be less likely to question a legal marriage, and traveling together would be more proper. "Is that the only reason?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Margaret finally met his gaze, vulnerability evident in her eyes. What other reason would there be? The air between them seemed to thicken. William reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "Perhaps because in just a few days, you've made this cabin feel more like a home than it has in 3 years. Because when I think of leaving, it's not the land I'm sorry to lose, but the future I might have built here with you." Color rose in her cheeks. "William, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know we barely know each other. But I also know that when that marshal looked at you today, I would have done anything to protect you. And that terrifies me, because I've spent years believing that caring for someone is the surest way to lose them. And now I think perhaps the risk of never caring at all is greater." Margaret turned her hand beneath his, lacing their fingers together. "When I answered your advertisement, I told myself it was merely a practical arrangement. Safety, security, a fresh start. But reading your letters, I began to hope for more. Then I arrived and found a man determined to send me away, and I thought I had been a fool." "You weren't," William said softly. "I was." They sat in silence, hands joined across the table, the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the moon rose over the snow-covered landscape, casting long shadows across the pristine white. "If we marry," William said finally, "it wouldn't be just for appearance's sake. Not for me." Margaret's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "Nor for me." "Then will you, Margaret Allen? Will you marry me before we leave this place? Not because we must, but because we choose to." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yes, William Rutherford. I will." They were married the next morning by Holloway, who, as it happened, was also the local justice of the peace. His wife served as witness, beaming at the unlikely couple who had appeared on her doorstep at dawn with their request. "Never thought I'd see the day," Holloway said as he signed the certificate. "Rutherford finally tamed by love. Your father would be shocked." "No," William replied, looking at Margaret in her simple blue dress, a wildflower tucked into her honey-gold hair. "I think he'd understand, finally." They left immediately after the ceremony, their few possessions packed into William's wagon. He had sold his livestock to Holloway for a fair price, enough to give them a start elsewhere. As they drove away from the homestead, Margaret turned to look back at the small cabin growing distant behind them. "Are you sad to leave it?" she asked. William followed her gaze. "No, it was never really home. Just a place I was hiding." They traveled west, keeping to less traveled routes, spending nights beneath the stars or in small wayside inns where they registered proudly as Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford. William found himself marveling at how quickly the fear of connection had given way to the joy of it. How Margaret's hand in his felt not like a burden but a gift. How sharing his thoughts with her lightened rather than weakened him. For her part, Margaret bloomed in the freedom of their journey, the shadow of her past receding with each mile westward. She spoke of her hopes for their future, Perhaps a small medical practice alongside whatever work William chose. A home filled with books and learning. Maybe someday children. I never allowed myself to want those things before, she confessed one night as they lay together beneath their wagon during a spring rain shower. I thought I had to choose between independence and love. William pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. And now I think perhaps they're not so different after all. Both require courage. Both demand we open ourselves to possibility. Their journey took them through mountain passes still heavy with spring snow, across rivers swollen with melt, and finally into the high valleys of Idaho Territory. William's friend Thomas greeted them warmly, offering the use of a small cabin on his property until they could establish themselves. It was there, on their first night in their new home, that Margaret came to him as his wife in truth as well as name. In the privacy of their rough-hewn bedroom, she unbound her honey-gold hair and whispered the words that gave this story its title. We're alone now. Let's do what must be done. But there was no duty in their coming together, only tenderness and discovering and the sweet revelation that bodies, like hearts, can speak truths too profound for words. Later, as moonlight spilled through the uncurtained window, William traced the curve of his wife's cheek with wondering fingers. I spent so long convinced that to survive the West, I had to stand alone. Margaret caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm. And what do you believe now? That perhaps the frontier isn't something to be conquered alone, but something to be transformed together. That in this wild place, building something tender isn't foolishness but the greatest act of courage. She smiled, pulling him close. Then we shall be very courageous indeed. 5 years later, the Rutherford homestead stood as testament to that courage. A thriving farm with orchards beginning to bear fruit, fields of wheat golden in the summer sun, and a house built with both beauty and practicality in mind. Margaret's small medical practice had become essential to the surrounding community, her knowledge and compassion earning her the respect of even the most traditional settlers. William had found his calling in horse breeding, his sturdy, intelligent animals in high demand throughout the territory. But their greatest joy was their family. 3-year-old Emma with her father's wheat-colored hair and serious eyes, and the infant son sleeping in his cradle by the fire. Their home hummed with life and purpose, the walls adorned with books and drawings and all the small treasures that transform a house into something sacred. The marshal from Montana never found them. Perhaps he had given up the search, or perhaps the doctor's family had found another target for their vengeance. It mattered little now. Their new community would have closed ranks around them regardless, for the Rutherfords had become beloved fixtures in the valley. On the anniversary of their hasty wedding, William found Margaret standing on their porch at sunset, watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard. He slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that had become tradition between them. Margaret leaned back against him, covering his hands with her own. "Only that we wasted so much time being afraid." "Not wasted," William corrected gently. "Perhaps we needed that time to become the people who could recognize each other when we met." She turned in his arms, her blue eyes as clear and beautiful as the day she'd stepped down from that wagon into his life. "The frontier does take everything you love," she said, echoing his father's bitter warning from so long ago. "But only to return it transformed into something stronger." William smiled, thinking of how his father had been both right and terribly wrong. The West was harsh, unforgiving, demanding everything a person had to give. But what his father had never understood was that it was precisely in that giving, that vulnerable, courageous opening of oneself to possibility, that the true promise of the frontier was fulfilled. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, William Rutherford held his wife close, surrounded by the home and family they had built together, and knew with bone-deep certainty that some treasures were worth every risk.